Hey there, it's Dan Kenner with episode number 99 of the podcast. We're so close to 100. I cannot believe it. It's wild how fast time goes. But today is Monday, November 27th, 2023, as I record this. And today we're talking to Nicholas Williams about perfecting your writing technique. So this is actually something that is fascinating to me as someone who hasn't actually done a lot of time, taken a lot of time to study technique. It's not that I don't want to. A lot of the technique that I've learned just comes from my consumption of media, consumption of books and everything. So whether or not that's a good or bad thing, it really comes down to my intuition. So it's interesting to pick his brain a little bit from someone who has a little bit more of a structured approach to his writing scene. So it's a really fascinating conversation. You want to stick around for that. He has a lot of great tips too. So something that I've never thought of. He talks a little bit about systems that he's used, to perfect that technique. So, other than that, updates about my life. This last week has been a little bit more chaotic than I expected it to be. My family all got sick, and it's lingering. I don't know what it is. Don't know if it's COVID or just a cold or whatever, but it started actually prior to my last podcast that I put out last week, and it just kind of bled into everybody in the family, and it's just kind of lingering. So lots of runny nose, lots of coughing, hurting chest, headaches, fevers all over the place, and it's just because it's just lasted. It has made it very challenging to get any writing or progress done on the author business, which, it is what it is. I tell myself times and seasons. During the winter, I'm often able to get more things done because I'm not outside working all the time. And during the summer, I don't get to write as often as I'd like to, but, it is what it is. It's just times and seasons. So that being said, this is a sick time. And I don't know that I did any writing, frankly, in the past 7 days, which, asked me a year ago, that probably would have frustrated me to no end that I didn't get any writing. But nowadays it is what it is. It's part of living with a family. We have 6 kids. We've got a whole bunch of animals that I have to take care of on the daily, twice a day. And it's getting colder, which makes things even more tricky outside. Although we have streamlined some things, I've talked a little bit about it in some of my past podcasts, which is helpful. I don't have to refresh their water as often due to heated buckets. Definitely worth the investment. But still, there's just a lot going on. So I would really like to get back into the writing scene. I'm working on a short story that I will be submitting to Writers of the Future. Again, I mentioned a couple podcasts ago that I just on a whim submitted something that I wrote super quickly, didn't do a lot of editing on, and it got a silver honorable mention, which I think is a good thing. It was very encouraging that my writing actually does have some value. Now, it wasn't polished at all because I didn't have a lot of time to polish. I think I wrote this like 2 weeks before the deadline. I was like, I just have to hastily throw this in. So I'm trying to get ahead of it. The deadline is end of December. We still have a whole month. I'm probably about halfway through the short story, and I can really write it probably in a few more days. I just have to actually sit down and write. So that's what I'm going to be working on. And I'll get back into Demon Blooded, which I'm still having a blast with. Still about let's say just over halfway through that book, which is exciting. Next week will be episode number 100. We'll talk a little bit more about that one, but I've got some fun announcements to throw in there around my author business. Should be interesting. We'll see how that goes. But I've been working on, what's cooking, getting it all put together and prepared for you to be able to announce it on episode 100. So that should be fun. In terms of homestead life, I kind of mixed it in there. We actually did sell another goat. So it was a little bit unexpected. We have a goat that we dried up because she was just not, she wasn't behaving. She's a friendly goat, but for some reason, she's just getting really weird around us. And she also didn't have the best udder possible. My wife and I are adults, right? So we have bigger hands, and when her teats and udder are just very small, and it doesn't jive well. There's lots of spraying ourselves with milk, which when it's freezing outside, the last thing you want to do is get a lap full of milk because you're trying to aim it in the bucket and it's just not working. Now, that may be an overshare for you, but she was just not jiving with her family. So we dried her up, no big deal. But, at that point, a dry goat that doesn't really milk very well for your family, there's really no point in keeping her. So we put her up for sale, and surprisingly, someone wanted to buy her very quickly. Granted, we did put her up for relatively cheap, not because we didn't really need a profit from her. We just wanted her to find a better home. And we actually sold her to a little girl for her 4-H program. So another homeschooled girl lives close by to us. We told her about the milking problem. She's like, oh, no concern for me. She's got little hands. She's a little kid. So they're planning on breeding her and milking her next year. So we're just glad that she found a new home. We really did like the goat. She just became a little bit tricky, particularly in this situation. And with my wife feeling sick, it wasn't driving. So very happy that that goat found a new home. We did, I don't know if I talked about this last week. We did move goats around. So if you know anything about a homestead with a male animal and female animals, is you have to keep them separate, right? Regardless of whatever they are, cows, goats, sheep, yada yada. Unless you want them to be constantly having babies. Well, our buck, who's the male goat, we've kept separate with his friend, who is another buck but castrated, across our yard from each other. Now, it's come to breeding time, which means we got to switch some things around. We put the baby goat we kept from this year's kidding situation. We moved her over there because we don't want her to get bred. She's still too little. And plus it's her dad, so that's weird. But we switched her and the dad. And it was wild. So first off, bucks are disgusting, and you have to touch him, right? Because I have to get him on the leash and move him around, and so that stinks. All of my clothes that I was wearing at the time will probably stink for the next year. It is what it is. That's fine. But of course, when you put him in, it's pandemonium because this is a buck who goes in rut every year, and there's no females around him to, react with. Granted, he's used to it. He's fine. He's not a big deal. He doesn't complain. But you put him in a situation where there are now 4 lovely females. He went wild. So, I mean, they're used to it. They can defend themselves. The does can totally defend themselves. But I felt a little bad. It takes, half a day or more before they all settle with each other and there's no fighting. They actually eat. Anyway, it was wild, and we've done it every year. For some reason this year they seemed a little bit more chaotic. Now everything's settled. He's still not super friendly. He just wants to be with them. I'll say it that way just to keep this rated PG. But they just run, or they'll headbutt him or whatever. So I think they're all kind of getting used to it now. He's been in there for a little under a week. And he'll be there for another 5. That's just to make sure that everybody gets bred. The best thing you can do with animals, unless you get an ultrasound, which we're not going to do. It's kind of expensive. It's not really worth it for us. So you just have to wait through their next cycle just to make sure that they don't go into heat again, is what it's called. They don't ovulate, or in essence, that's what it is. And all the signs will not be there in 3 weeks. So they're pretty clear signs. Pretty well when they're in that situation. So we'll just wait another 3 weeks, make sure we don't see any of those signs again, which means they're bred, and then we'll move him back. So we do like to do it 6 weeks just to cover our bases. But yeah, it's great. They're having a ball. Let's just say it that way. It is interesting though to see how Merrick. Yes, we have a goat named Merrick, the main character in my Light Bear Chronicles. A little bit funny there, but Merrick, watching him react to another female since he's been castrated, he's not been around any females. So it doesn't really matter. Like he shouldn't really have those instincts because he doesn't really have the same hormones running through his body. Surprisingly, I don't know if he just learned from being around the buck all the time. He's acting very bucky is what we call it, just snorting and chittering, and it's weird. It's super weird, but he's harmless. He can't do anything. I think he's just mildly annoying that baby because he tries get near, and she just looks at him like, what the heck are you doing? So kind of funny to see their interactions though. Something that we've never dealt with before. He'll probably be very disappointed when we switch him back because he's now the dominant one. With the buck in the pen with him, he's not dominant. He kind of gets beat up on. I don't mean that in a literal sense. There's no actual beating up, but he's bullied a little bit. It's hard. There's not much you can do about that. He's used to it. He gets plenty of food because he's fat, but in any case, that's fun. That's a good situation. And we started getting eggs again, which sounds really funny, but for a long period there, we were getting no eggs, and we discovered something, which I had not expected at all, was that the reason that our flock was not laying was because we had too many roosters. I didn't know this was a thing. We had been researching, maybe their food content, maybe the protein content isn't right. Maybe they're not getting enough sunlight. We built them an outdoor run. We were going to do that anyway, but we tried all sorts of things and they weren't laying. Coincidentally, we finally made the time to butcher the extra roosters that we had, leaving only 2. and suddenly the eggs start coming. I was thinking, oh, I guess maybe they were just really stressed because they had all of these roosters chasing them around. Now we have around 35 hens, I think, 35 hens we had like 6 or 7 roosters. Apparently that ratio is still wrong. They were stressing them out and they just weren't laying. The moment we got rid of those roosters, they started laying, which is amazing. It's great to have eggs again. They don't feel like a resource suck on our homestead anymore. And we're just great to see eggs every single day. Right about the time I have to go check them regularly, because if I don't get the eggs, they will start freezing in the boxes and cracking and getting wasted. So super fun times. In any case, those are the things we're thinking about on the homestead. Nothing else is really going on other than just maintaining through the winter. Do what you got to do, which we're looking forward to. This winter is going to be great. I don't believe there's any other updates today, so we can go ahead and shift over to the interview portion of the podcast. Hey, Nick, how are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me.
I'm
Great to
thrilled
be
to
here.
have you. I'm honestly very interested to hear what you have to say about the technical aspects of writing from someone who discovery writes everything.
Yeah.
These are the types of conversations that are fascinating. But before we dive into
Okay.
that, how long have you been writing and publishing?
Ooh. I think like as most writers would probably say, like I've been writing basically all my life and I just did it on and off for my entire life. But then it was like about 10 years ago that I realized I really wanted to take it seriously. So then I just started working in critique
Hmm.
groups, and that's when I started writing more on a professional level, I guess.
Okay. So it looks like you have a book that was published in 2019. Is that correct? Was that your first book
Yeah, that
then?
was my first, that was my debut novel. Didn't do so great, if I'm being honest. I learned a lot by writing it, and it's a book that's close to my heart. I care about it, but I definitely see the faults of it. And then when I felt like I started my next book, I felt a lot stronger of a position to write something that would be great for audiences.
Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit more. I understand the whole you wrote something, didn't do as well as you expected. Great to learn
Yeah.
from it. But when did you first realize that maybe you had to take a look at your writing and improve it before your next book?
Uh, Between the book that I just wrote with Had Me at Halo, are you talking about like basically between
Yeah.
yeah, my debut? That's kind of a tough question. I guess I just always because ever since I started writing my debut novel, I've been working in critique groups. And so up until today, I really found like my inner circle of writers that I just really like working with, and they take it just as seriously as I do. And it's really just been workshopping with them and learning from each other that we've just been growing so much that I felt like I had the tools now where I could tell a compelling enough story for Had Me at Halo. And so when I went into Had Me at Halo, I felt like I was much better equipped to tell that story.
So I think that's awesome, particularly finding a group of readers. Writing can be very isolating a
Yeah.
practice and or job if
Yep.
you're working full time. So how did you find these groups of authors? Was this just people you came across on social media? Are they friends that you grew up with? How did you meet up with them?
I met them all online. I haven't met any of them in person.
Oh, interesting.
I met on a website called Scribophile.
Hmm.
So I joined that website about 10-ish years ago, and I highly recommend it to anybody. So it's almost like a social media platform for specifically writers,
Cool.
and you have to have a login to get in. And the whole atmosphere of it is that you gain karma by critiquing other people's works, and then you cash in that karma to post your own work to get that critiqued. And it's very has a very professional feel on it. It takes a membership fee to join, but in my opinion, it's incredibly worth it. And it's through that website that I've made friends that have lasted for years, and I found other authors who are just as serious as about it as I was.
That's really cool. So is the intent then to move into a professional scene with your writing? Are you hoping someday to be a full-time author?
I would love that, but I kind of focus on short-term goals at the moment. I mean, what I would love right now is just any kind of platform where I get some kind of momentum where um, I see week to week sales or, I have people anticipating my next release and the reviews keep growing with every subsequent book I release. That's kind of my short-term goal right now is to build something of a platform, no matter how small.
Yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
great to have readers, however few, however many, that are super fans, right? You've heard
Yeah.
that term before. That's
Yeah.
that's what I think all of us would love. And I'd like the short-term goal. I know there's a lot of authors that plan things out years into the future. I'm not one of those. It sounds
No,
like
no.
maybe you're not either. So I think, either way works just fine. But for you, you talked a little bit about, prior to this, you love comedic writing.
Oh
And you
yeah.
also
Yeah.
love just like the technical aspects of writing a compelling story. So I want to talk a little bit about that. How did you learn about these aspects of a compelling story? Was it reading lots of books, listening to podcasts? I mean, where did you gain this information?
The compelling story really, I mean, it's just through learning through my own writing and then working through the writers on Scribophile. But
Hmm.
I just always became fascinated with that feeling where I would get really invested into a story and I just became so hooked. And I think as an engineer, like I always had that sort of mindset. I want to like reverse engineer that feeling. I want to try to see like what the rules and what are like the general principles behind creating that compelling storyline is because I mean we like to think of stories as being very artistic and expressionate and there's nothing wrong with that of course and that's a very beautiful perspective but the approach I've always looked at stories has been almost more of what's like the technical side of it and that always fascinated me.
So I love this. I think it's awesome because a writer like myself, I'm a very intuitive writer. Actually, maybe I should start asking you this just to make sure, because you could be a discovery writer yourself. How do you generally go about writing your books? Do you plot everything out, or do you generally kind of discover it as you write it?
Ironically, after saying that, people would probably assume I'm a plotter, but I'm actually more of a pantser.
I think that's
And
awesome. Yeah.
it's like I first became a plotter and I felt like I was that person that had to have everything defined. And plotting was helpful in figuring out like what the rules and what the principles were and creating like a compelling story and how to achieve that. But then it was like through the feedback that I got that I really understood what those were. And then once I had that understanding, it felt like it made me a better pantser because I could see. Um, I know I'm speaking very generically here, but as I'm writing through the lens of the character, I can see where the story is going, and I can apply the principles I learn uh, to create like something that people would find interesting in really quickly.
Well, I'm glad we clarified that because I definitely was thinking, sounds like he's a very heavy plotter. But then I paused. I was like, wait a minute, he didn't actually technically say that. So we wanted to clarify. And I think that's great. I think the way you described the elements of a compelling story, learning those from your writing group or from Scribophile, and then just having them kind of front of mind as you are pantsing or discovering your story, I think that definitely reflects the feeling of being an intuitive writer, being a discovery writer, because a lot of it is, hey, you have these
Yeah,
principles, you have this idea of what a compelling story is, and you have to gain that at some point. And like you said, it kind of came through your own writing, through this group. I was, for some reason, and this is okay that you don't have this. For some reason, I was expecting, oh, these technical aspects of writing. I have bullet points of have this on this page, have this 30% through,
yeah,
yada, whatever those things are, save the cat type mentality, which once again, I'm not
yeah,
downplaying that. It doesn't work for me. My
yeah.
brain does not work with that.
No, no, yeah. I think like one of the downsides with plotting from a high level like that is it's really hard to get into the the seat of the main character.
Mhm.
And you know, so all this is going to be, based on my approach. It's not me saying like what's fact or, you have to do this. It's just what my approach is. But it's always been treating the main character's wants as the number one priority is always to me. It's establishing that, getting readers to empathize with that. And sometimes it's hardest to know where the story is going when you're trying to drive it from a want perspective. Like, what does this
Mm.
character want? If you're looking at it from a high level perspective, you can say generically, like, oh, I think they would want this, and therefore they would go in this direction. But the nice thing with pantsing, I discovered, is that you really almost find nuance in what their wants would be, and you can find ways to show their character in stronger ways and how they demonstrate what they do to get those wants and what they want and what they're looking to achieve. And so I found being a pantser is a lot more effective when I want to drive the story based on those wants.
Well, and I agree. I think a lot of the times I've talked to pantsers or discovery writers, we can all agree that it's very character driven, right? Because your characters will make decisions
Yeah.
as a result of things that are happening around them, and you can't always plan on that. Like,
Yeah.
for example, when I've been writing some of my books, some of my characters in the epic trilogy I wrote, I thought they were one specific way, like this is their
Yeah.
personality, this is how they're going to behave in certain situations. But then you get to a situation, it's just like, nope, she would
Yeah, they
not do
wouldn't
that.
do that.
Yeah,
Right,
they would
exactly.
not do that. This is instead what they do. Sometimes it's stupid,
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
sometimes it's very unfounded or unwise, but it's just like that's what they would do. And it just, it
exactly.
leads the story one. And I love that part of the writing. I cannot even imagine planning it out because I
Oh
don't
yeah.
know. People are so unpredictable that it's the same with your
Yeah, and if
characters.
you plotted that, then you're faced with a really tough decision. You're like, okay, do I tie some shoelace together, force the character to do this thing that would ruin their character just to continue with this template I made? Or do I scrap the whole template and stay true to the character? And that's like a really tough decision to make when you're a plotter and you inevitably will hit that several times.
Oh, absolutely. Although I have met some people who are very heavy plotters, but they are, I guess their brain can just process all of that information. It's almost like chess players, right? Like a chess player
Yeah.
can see however many moves ahead. I
Yeah.
don't and I can't. So it's easier
Yeah.
just to take it as it comes. If I try to plot, it just doesn't
Yeah.
behave for me. But
Yeah,
another
maybe
plotter might work.
yeah. Yeah, maybe for plotters their brain just works differently and they're like listening to this podcast thinking like, what do you mean? I can see every single move ahead of time and I know exactly what the characters want and 20 steps from now I know what they want.
I think
Yeah.
sometimes they do. Now it depends. I think most people are spectrum, right? Some people have like
Yeah.
a loose plot, some people have no plot, some people have very,
Yeah.
very strict. So I mean, the spectrum, you don't have to define it, but at the end of the day, what we are doing as authors is creating those compelling stories. We are drawing readers in. We're keeping them reading until the last page and
Yeah.
through a series. So for you, this is probably really hard to define. But, based on what you've learned, what are some of the biggest or most important elements of a compelling story? I mean, we talked a little bit about characters. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. So the basis for me, like what I use to define what I want to achieve for a compelling story, is I base it all on the wants of the main character. The wants is what I always go back to. And it's just always asking, like, what does this character want very plainly? And then, and I'm in the belief that you can have this character want anything and you could like they could just want a glass of water, for example, and that's the whole story. But you could make a compelling story just about them wanting a glass of water if you could build the empathy of the readers connecting with the reasons for wanting that and them hitting obstacles to get something just as simple as a glass of water. I mean, you could theoretically, I believe you could tell a compelling story based on just the most trivial wants, but if you have that clearly defined and you can get readers invested and behind it and you can create like a sense of stakes and what's at loss, what's the gain, what's the lose, and the risks are involved, it can become something very compelling.
Absolutely. I think so. You said a lot of things there that were absolutely amazing. I want to double click on a couple of those things because I want to, pick your brain about those a little bit. One of the first things you talked about characters' wants, and I just want to point out that that is where your setting and the rules of whatever you're, whether it's the real world or a fantasy world or sci-fi, space or whatever, there are certain constraints that are going to make this character's wants more challenging. And
Yeah,
so when the constraints of the world come up against the wants of the character, that's when things get interesting, right?
yeah,
Is because sometimes it's not, for example, the character wants a glass of water, but no water within 100 miles is safe enough for them to drink. Oh, well,
yeah,
suddenly getting a glass of water is a lot more interesting, right?
yeah,
Just a
yeah,
random example.
right.
And so I think I've heard of people trying to do the opposite and they write themselves in circles because they're not sure what to do. They have a setting that's really compelling, this really amazing world with all these rules and languages, and it's awesome. And then they're just trying to bring their characters through this world. That's not very
Yeah,
compelling, right? Because it's just like
no, yeah,
the world is great. I love the world building you've done, but nothing's happening, right?
right.
Because they're not the characters. It's not clear what they want. So I don't know. Have you had any troubles with that yourself, or have you have any examples of people who have struggled with the setting character kind of combined approach?
Mm. Uh, no, I haven't struggled with that too much at all. I haven't really been too much of a world builder myself.
Not a problem. Yeah,
I usually just build enough of it
yeah.
to create like basically an interesting plot or interesting like dilemma or conflict to what the wants are.
Hmm.
I love doing things like that. Like I think Black Mirror does an amazing job at that. It's like minimal world building, but the minimal world building that they do acts in some way as a conflict to
Yeah.
what the main character wants. And it creates this really interesting perspective of it's like, okay, I empathize with what this character wants, but due to this technology, it's sort of flipped in a different way. And it kind of forces you to almost reflect upon yourself and how you would react in those types of situations. I love sci-fi fantasy for those reasons. It forces us to kind of analyze ourselves, I guess,
Hmm.
and the decisions that we'd make in like with certain worlds, I guess,
Hmm.
and certain world building.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. I think world building works according to the author and the story because in some places it's more appropriate to have deeper world building, in some places it's more appropriate to not, and I think it can work either
Yeah.
way. It really comes down, that's where the character fills it in, right? That character and their wants and their desires. The other question I wanted to ask you is, you talked a little bit about the character, the stakes and the character's
Yeah.
goal. So one thing that frustrates me as a reader is when you're reading a book and you get a third, a fourth of the way through, and you have no idea what they're even doing. You're like, what's the point? Like, what do you want? Where are you going? There's no goals or stakes or anything. And so for you, how do you ensure that your books, this is hypothetical, it doesn't have to be you
Yeah.
specifically, but how can an author ensure that they have the right stakes or high enough stakes and or goals of the character to
Mm,
keep the story driving forward?
yeah. So a common term that's used is called pinch points. So if you have the first point, let me back up, is like if you get the wants established, that's basically the driver for the conflict. That's the driver for the plot. If you have a character that's very well established and have a very strong want, and they have a conflict to that want, then you immediately have some kind of plot there. It's
Mhm.
them overcoming whatever that conflict is to try to get their want. And then, so that's at the start. You establish that at the start. And my goal there is to build as much empathy to that want as much as possible. Because the stronger the empathy, the more that the reader can be empathetic to the goals of the main character, the more that reader will connect and resonate when they face struggles, they face hardship, and they might not get exactly what they want. And so that's when these pinch points really come into play. And so the pinch points is usually where you're raising the stakes, or you make it. So from my perspective, a pinch point can either be defined by raising the stakes or by making it harder to achieve that goal. And so you introduce something that, and usually pinch points, the nice thing about those is that they give the plot a sense of forward momentum. It's like you think the plot's going in some way and you think it's moving in a certain direction, but oh man, now we're on a time limit. Now we got to get it done. Instead of a month, now we have a week to get it done.
Right.
And then it creates a sense of like forward drive and forward momentum. And so in that case, having the timeline shortened, that makes it harder to achieve the goal. But it could also be raising the stakes. What's at stake for the character if they lose or gain or win. If the stakes are much greater, then it builds a sense of forward momentum.
Absolutely. I like the way you said that. The forward momentum is, I think, a piece that a lot of our authors can be a little bit more sensitive to as they're writing, because I think I'm not this way, particularly because I'm not very verbose in the way I write. That's just my nature of how my vocabulary is not massive. I'm using a thesaurus all the time, which is great. But for me, it's a little bit easier to be sensitive to, hey, this is getting kind of slow. Something needs to happen, right? There needs either a stake change or time change or something that's going to drive this story forward. And I think where authors can fall into pits is when they aren't as sensitive to that, to really be able to step back and say, what's actually happening right now? Is it being driven forward? If not, what do I need to change to drive it forward? Or what is the story? What is the character? What do they need to decide? There's all sorts of options, right? And there's probably thousands of recommendations on how to get it to move forward, but you need to be sensitive to that. Obviously, it should ebb and flow a little bit, but for the most part, it should be pretty easy for a majority of the book for the person reading to say, this is what the character wants, and this is what their goal is, right? This is what they're working towards. If you can't answer those questions, then something needs to change. The reader needs to know the answers to those.
And that's a lot of times why the middle can be so slow for a lot of readers and writers, is because they don't have those pinch points in the place, or they don't have it develop, and it creates this loss of forward momentum.
Like the middle book syndrome. I've read a lot of trilogies. No, they're not all the same. Some trilogies, the second book is driven forward, but there are a lot of trilogies where the second book kind of lags, because it's just like it's between the first starter, hey, I'm excited about all this, and the third book, everything's falling apart, the world is ending. What do you do? And so it's that kind of middle, those pinch points, I think, like you said, they kind of fall out, or maybe they're not as grave in that second book. So obviously not every trilogy, but I've read a lot of trilogies, and it does seem to be a common theme in some of them.
You hear a lot about that. Like
kind of super interesting to hear that. So I want to talk a little bit about Had Me at Halo, because this is the second book and the story that you revamped to get going a little bit more. So let's talk a little bit about, obviously without spoilers, what is the book? How do you know that you've created a compelling story with these characters?
It's so with Had Me at Halo, it kind of ties back to what I mentioned with Black Mirror, where it takes like this romance type of story, but then introduces like an interesting premise to it, and it introduces this world as a sort of catalyst to creating this unique story. So what it's about is this man and his fiance die, and they had a soul bond. And in my world, if you die and you have a soul bond with somebody else, you get to spend eternity with that person. And the soul bond isn't determined by you; it's determined by the relationship you have. It's determined by how strong is that relationship. But this man, his name is Liam, and his fiance, that soul bond breaks, and he has this guardian angel named Amara. Amara's job relies on the establishment of that soul bond. So she concocts a solution where Liam goes back in time before he meets his fiance, tries to get her to fall in love, and in this timeline, his fiance hasn't met him before, so he's approaching her from, from basically brand new from her eyes, and in an attempt to reestablish the soul bond again. And so I guess, and that's basically the premise of the book, is him trying to establish the soul bond within a certain amount of time in order for him to spend eternity with his fiance and for Amara to keep her job as a guardian angel. And so it creates like that interesting premise with how the world building, it sort of introduces something like that. Um, but then to answer your question about the compelling story, you learn and you connect with Liam that what he truly wants is this family, is the reason why it's not just he loves his fiance. It's like, well, why does he love her? And it's really fleshing that out and digging into that. And the reason why he loved her so much is because she was the family that he never really had. He never really had much of a family growing up, so he kind of had that found family through her. And then you just get that sort of angst that he's trying to get closer and closer to Sienna. And hopefully by this point, the readers are very invested in his goal and what he wants to achieve. But then, it's kind of a twist where he realizes that what he truly wants is through the guardian angel instead. So it's a love triangle there where he learns that as he gets closer to his want, he realizes how getting the soul bond with his fiance isn't going to achieve that want. It's actually going to be through the guardian angel instead. And so that's sort of and that's basically how I created the, in my opinion, what I think is a pretty compelling story, because you get so invested in what he wants and why he wants to be with her, and then you realize she might not be exactly who he hopes for, and that he's just projecting this fantasy onto this woman who doesn't really fit that mold for him, because she's just not that same way. Whereas the guardian angel shares those values with him.
That sounds fascinating. Sounds very compelling. The reviews are great on it already.
Yeah.
And you published this just a little less than a month ago. Is that correct?
Yeah, less than a month.
So I think that's awesome. Seems like the launch has gone very well. People are clearly invested
Yeah.
in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
this
pretty
is
good. Yeah, it's doing pretty good.
so this is the book that you put on Scribophile for people to take a look at, or
Uh,
was it a different story?
yeah. Yeah, I did put it on Scribophile. I had a few people. I got about 12 beta readers.
Nice.
Most of them were from Scribophile, and I did it in about 4 rounds. So I had
Okay.
like 2 beta readers, and then like another 3 beta readers for round 2, 3 beta readers round 3, and then the rest for round 4. It was something
Wow.
like that. So I
That
went
sounds
through a lot
awesome.
of revisions, and yeah, most of them I met through Scribophile. It's a great site.
So this is just a logistical question. How do you survive through that many iterations of the story? I'm
What?
asking for a friend and for myself.
Oh yeah, yeah.
What's your
Like
secret?
survive in what way? Just like editing hell, or
Just yeah, I mean, there's the idea. I read my story tons of times. Obviously, I'm
yeah,
editing, reading through it.
yeah.
But by about the third time, I want to throw something against the wall.
Mm,
And it's just part of the reason I don't plot. Right, I don't plot my
yeah,
story because if I know what's going to happen to the end, then I already know the story, and there's no reason to write the story because I know
yeah,
all the answers. Right, I'm bored of it.
yeah.
How do you how do you keep your interest in
Uh,
reading your story that many times? And this is just the first, right? And then you still have to do the edits after that, after
yeah,
you do the betas.
yeah. I'm afraid I'm gonna have the worst answer for this. I think my mind just can get invested in a singular story, and the longer I spend on a story, the more invested I get. I know a lot of
Mm,
authors that what they struggle with is they think of new works in progress and they want to chase this one and chase that one. I have the exact opposite problem. I want to keep workshopping on the same one. And once I feel like I get my teeth into a book, into like what I'm writing, I just can't let go of it. It's all I think about. So it's unfortunately that's a really bad, not very helpful answer.
Well,
But
no, I
that's
don't
the
think
truth. That's me being candid, to be
I don't
honest.
think it's a bad answer at all. I think it's, it speaks to personality because I think there's definitely an important part of workshopping. I think there's also something good to be said of, having other stories in your mind and wanting to chase those. You need to find a balance in the middle. Did you think this has any part to do with your work as a software engineer? We didn't talk that much on the podcast about that, but you're a software engineer, correct? By
Yeah,
trade.
yeah.
Do you think that perhaps your skills in that area lends to you being able to workshop this story more effectively? I don't know. I'm not a software engineer.
Maybe. Yeah, I
So I
mean, there
can't speak to
probably
that.
is some kind of resemblance, but it was like when I first started, how I mentioned I thought I was a plotter because, in software you have to plan quite a bit and you have to do a
Mm-hmm.
lot of structural, you have to do a lot of uh, creating a lot of structure basically. There's a lot of organization to it. And then I thought I had to be the same way in my writing, but yeah, I'm not that way at all. I do approach it from a very pantsing perspective with my writing.
I mean, self-discovery is part of the process. So,
Yeah, I like
but
Discovery Writer more, by the way. I've been hearing that more and more often.
well, so the
It
reason
sounds nicer than
it
pantsing.
it does sound nicer. Coincidentally, that term I got it from. Have you ever heard of the Creative Pen by any chance? You listen to that podcast?
No, I haven't.
No. So Joanna Penn is a full-time indie author. She has a career. She's an entrepreneur based on her indie publishing and nonfiction career as well. But she's in Bath in in England, right? So there in British English, pants it actually means underwear, and so they don't like to use the word pantsing because that just sounds weird, right? It just
Yeah.
doesn't jive well.
Oh,
So
wow.
she uses discovery writing, and she says it multiple
Oh.
times. Like, I know this is technically pantsing, but I don't like to say that for this very reason. So she calls it discovery writing, which is, I've tried to adopt it a little bit myself as well.
I
But
like it a lot more, by the way, to
it
be
it
honest.
it feels a little bit less like
Yeah.
um garbage fiery.
Yeah.
Not that
Yeah.
pantsing is a garbage fire, but it does sound a lot more negative, right? Particularly because there are
Right.
very famous authors like Stephen King himself who are
Pants. Yeah.
pantsers, right? They're
Yeah.
discovery writers. So when you don't call it pantsing, it doesn't sound a little bit like hot and sloppy. It's actually no,
Yeah.
it's just a different method for writing, right? You
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
plan it out, you can plot it out, or you can discover it as you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you
Exactly.
know, there you go. There's another term in your arsenal that you can
Yeah.
use
Yeah.
for whatever you'd like.
Well,
But
yeah. Thank you.
no, I appreciate your speaking to compelling stories because I agree. I think as a reader, whatever your preferences are genre wise, everybody responds better to a compelling story, whatever it is, and whatever genre. It's something that we're very sensitive to as readers, and that's why we DNF things. That's why
Yeah.
we don't finish books, is because the story isn't compelling enough for us. And that's okay, if you're a reader and you do that. But as authors, we want to write as compelling stories as possible. So
Yeah. Exactly.
I think that's awesome. So I appreciate you joining me today. This has been an excellent conversation. We are running short on time. So where can people find more information on you and your books if they want to check them out?
I have a website. It's called, or it goes by nfletchwilliams.com. Let me double check that. So I don't want to tell everyone the wrong website. Fletch, no, of course that's not right. I
Not a
don't
problem.
know. I don't even know what my
I
author
think so. I think I've got it
website
right
is.
here. Is it N Williams
Wow.
author?
Yep,
nwilliamsauthor.com, I believe is.
exactly.
Don't
Yep,
worry, it'll be
you're
in the show
exactly right.
notes. No one will click on the wrong link.
Yeah, yeah, I'm so glad I double checked that because I was like, there was a 50% chance I got that wrong. Yeah, and Williams author, thank
No
you.com.
problem.
And
And you're also on TikTok, I believe, correct?
yeah, yeah, I like spending a lot of time on TikTok. It's pretty fun on there, and I love the bookish community. I love I just love how more intimate, I want to say, like maybe that's not the right word, but it feels like you're a lot more vulnerable on
Mhm.
that platform and I've formed some pretty great relationships on TikTok, and so I love it on there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's great. Well, thank you for your time. This has been amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me.
I hope you found that as interesting and insightful as I did. Talking to Nicholas was fascinating to me because, his brain just works very differently than mine in terms of structuring everything. My method for learning and growing is just continuing consuming and just writing, 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 learning from that via the editing experience and getting feedback from readers. So, yeah, it's just fun to hear different people's perspectives on the way that they learn and grow in their writing. So, really enjoyed that. So next week is, believe it or not, episode number 100, which I still cannot believe. It's absolutely wild. I mentioned having a couple announcements, but the intent is to have a conversation with L. Blaze Hughes about the Kids of Cyber City. Coincidentally, that is also right around the release date for that entire trilogy. We're going to be reflecting on our experience co-authoring together, pros and cons, the things we learned, the things we liked and didn't like, perhaps, about co-authoring. And I think you want to stick around for that because it's going to be a great conversation. So if you'd like to join me on the podcast, just email me at authordkenner@gmail.com. Or, of course, you can head to thecasualauthor.com, fill out the pitch form there. It'll send it right to me, and I'll learn more about you and what you're all about. And I'd love to have you on the podcast. Definitely like and share this with your friends if you enjoy the content. And I look forward to talking to you next week.